Who invited you to the gala? He laughed, just loud enough for the people standing nearby to hear. Elena didn't answer him. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look angry either. She simply looked at him, quietly, the way someone does when they realize they've just learned something important about another person. She just stood there, pregnant, calm, and absolutely still. And in that moment, he thought he had won the room, but the words floated longer than he expected. What he didn't notice was the silence that followed, the way conversations stopped, the way smiles froze, the way powerful people suddenly looked past him instead of at him. And within minutes, everything he'd worked for began slipping away. Not because she said anything, but because the room finally saw her. The orchestra faltered just slightly, as if the room itself had inhaled. Julian didn't notice at first. He was still smiling, still riding the confidence of a night that had gone perfectly until it suddenly hadn't. And that was when Julian felt the shift. Before we continue, can I ask you a question? Where in the world are you watching from? Comment below. We'd love to know how far these stories travel. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button to stay fully locked in. Because if stories like this move you, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Julian Cross had built his life on moments like this, rooms like this. People who mattered standing close enough to hear him speak, far enough to be impressed by it. The Halston Grand wasn't just another venue. It was history wrapped in marble and gold. Old money. Quiet power. The kind of place where reputations were solidified without anyone ever raising their voice. Tonight was supposed to be his night. By the time the gala officially began, Julian had already shaken more hands than he could remember. He'd accepted compliments on his latest acquisition, laughed off a joke about how quickly his net worth seemed to grow, and nodded politely when someone mentioned his name alongside words like visionary and inevitable. That word followed him everywhere lately. Inevitable. The deal he was closing would secure his position among a different tier of wealth. Not flashy tech money, legacy money, trusts, boards, names that didn't appear on buildings because they owned the buildings. The Hawthorne Trust was at the center of it. Julian had spent months preparing for tonight. Private meetings, quiet dinners, strategic introductions. He knew exactly who would be there and exactly who he needed to impress. The margins were thin, but he'd calculated everything. Everything except Elena showing up. She wasn't supposed to be there, at least not in his plan. He'd told her the gala would be boring. Too long, too formal. Not worth the effort, especially now. He'd said it gently enough, he thought. Framed it as concern. She hadn't argued. So when he saw her, standing there, unmistakably pregnant, unmistakably present, something tight twisted behind his ribs. Not because she looked out of place, because she didn't. Lena wore a deep blue dress that didn't chase trends or demand attention. It simply fit her, flowing easily, the kind of elegance that didn't try to prove itself. Her hair was pulled back, minimal jewelry, nothing flashy, nothing wrong, and that unsettled him. Julian crossed the floor toward her, his smile already forming, rehearsed and effortless. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. He didn't raise it either. He delivered the line the way men like him often did, wrapped in humor, disguised as charm. Who invited you to the gala? He expected a reaction, a laugh, a comment, maybe even an apology for misunderstanding. Instead, Elena stayed silent. Behind him, someone shifted their weight. A conversation nearby trailed off. Julian felt it but dismissed it, chalking it up to coincidence. He took a sip of his champagne, still smiling, waiting for her to play along. "Elena," he added lightly, as if reminding her where they were. "You didn't need to come." Her gaze moved past him, just slightly, and that was when Julian noticed the woman standing a few feet away. Late 50s, pearl earrings, posture too composed to be staff. She was watching Elena with recognition, with interest. Julian frowned. Elena nodded politely to the woman, who returned it with something close to warmth. "Good evening," the woman said, her voice calm, assured. "It's nice to finally see you in person." Julian's smile tightened. They hadn't been introduced. The woman didn't look at him, not immediately. Her attention remained on Elena, as if Julian were the one who had wandered into a conversation uninvited. "We're glad you could make it," the woman continued. "Especially tonight." Elena inclined her head. "Thank you for asking me to come." Julian felt the first true flicker of unease. "Asked?" He opened his mouth to speak, but the woman turned to him then, her expression polite and unreadable. "Julian Cross," she said, as if confirming a name she already knew. "We were just discussing you." That should have pleased him. Instead, something in her tone made his stomach drop. The orchestra resumed, smoothing over the silence, but the room didn't fully recover. Julian sensed eyes moving, attention shifting in subtle ways he'd spent years learning to read. The people who had been leaning toward him moments ago now seemed angled elsewhere. Conversations rearranged themselves. Elena hadn't said a word to defend herself. She hadn't needed to. And somewhere beneath the chandeliers, Julian Cross began to understand that the night he thought he controlled was moving forward without him. Julian told himself he was imagining it. Rooms didn't turn on people that quickly. Not rooms like this. Not when money and reputation were involved. He took another sip of champagne, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, grounding himself in the certainty that this was still his territory. But the woman who had greeted Elena, her name tag read Margaret Lowell, had already stepped away, joining a small cluster of donors near the center of the room. Elena remained where she was, calm, composed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. Julian leaned closer to her, lowering his voice. "What are you doing here?" he asked, still smiling for anyone who might be watching. Elena met his eyes. "I was invited." "By who?" She hesitated just long enough to make the answer feel deliberate. "Margaret." Julian let out a quiet laugh. "You don't know Margaret Lowell." "I do now." That unsettled him more than he expected. Julian had grown up learning that access was everything. He didn't come from old money. His father had owned a small construction company that barely survived recessions, and his mother had stretched grocery lists into miracles. Julian learned early that rooms like this were locked, and the only way in was to make yourself indispensable, which he had done. By 35, his first company had sold for 9 figures. By 40, his name carried weight. He didn't beg for meetings anymore. People asked for his time. He was proud of that. He believed he'd earned every inch of his success. Elena had been there for most of it. They met years before the money turned serious, when ambition still felt romantic instead of exhausting. She had been working in strategic consulting then, sharp and observant, with a way of asking questions that made people reveal more than they intended. Julian loved that about her, at first. It made him feel understood. But as his world expanded, Hers seemed to contract. Or maybe he'd just stopped paying attention. When Elena told him she was pregnant, he'd been stunned in the quietest way. He'd hugged her, kissed her forehead, promised things would slow down. They never did. His calendar filled. Her presence became something he scheduled around, rather than centered. Tonight, he'd assumed she would stay home. Margaret Lowell was speaking now, her voice low, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. Julian caught pieces of the conversation as he drifted closer, pretending to check his phone. "The Hawthorne family is very particular," Margaret was saying. "They value discretion, continuity." Julian straightened. "That's why we've been so careful," another man replied, "especially with leadership." Leadership, that word again. Julian stepped forward, easing himself into the circle with practiced ease. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation." Margaret turned to him, her smile polite but distant. "Of course." "I'm glad Elena could join us," Julian added smoothly, placing a hand lightly at Elena's back. She didn't flinch, but she didn't lean into him either. Margaret's gaze flicked briefly to Julian's hand, then back to Elena. "So are we." The pause that followed was small, but noticeable. Julian pressed on. "I was just explaining to Elena how important tonight is," he said, "for all of us." "I'm sure," Margaret replied, "though I imagine Elena already understands." Julian felt heat rise to his neck. "I'm not sure I follow." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "The Hawthorne Trust doesn't move quickly," she said. "They prefer long-standing relationships. Shared values." Julian nodded, eager. "Which is exactly why this partnership makes sense." Margaret smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps." Elena shifted then, finally speaking. "Margaret," she said gently, "would you like me to introduce you to Mrs. Carter? She mentioned wanting to speak with you." Margaret's expression softened. "I would love that." The two women moved away together, leaving Julian standing where he was, his hand suspended briefly in the air before he let it fall. He told himself it meant nothing, but as the minutes passed, he noticed the pattern forming. Conversations he approached seemed to end just before he arrived. People who had sought him out earlier now offered quick smiles and excuses. No one was rude. No one confronted him. They simply disengaged. Across the room, Elena stood with Margaret and another woman Julian recognized from a Hawthorne board photo he'd studied obsessively. They were laughing softly, heads inclined toward one another in the way people did when they shared context. Context Julian suddenly lacked. He moved toward them, his pulse quickening, but Margaret glanced at her watch. "We should speak with the trustees," she said to Elena. "Of course," Elena replied. They walked past Julian without acknowledging him. He stood there, alone, beneath a chandelier that had felt triumphant an hour earlier and now felt accusatory. The orchestra swelled, filling the silence he hadn't realized surrounded him. Julian pulled out his phone and checked his messages. Nothing new. He typed a quick note to his assistant, asking if anything had changed. The reply came quickly. Nothing yet. Yet. He scanned the room again, this time with a different lens. He saw how Elena moved through the crowd. Not urgently, not nervously, but with quiet intention. She didn't dominate conversations, she listened. When she spoke, people leaned in. That had always been her strength. Julian remembered a dinner years ago, long before the money became overwhelming. He'd been frustrated after a failed pitch, venting loudly about how investors didn't see his vision. Elena had listened, then calmly pointed out the flaw in his argument. Not cruelly, just clearly. "You're talking too much," she'd said then. "You're not leaving space for them." He hadn't liked hearing that. Tonight the room was full of space, and none of it belonged to him. As the gala moved toward its midpoint, Julian felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear exactly. Something colder, a realization forming too slowly to stop. Whatever Elena was doing here, it wasn't accidental. And whatever he had laughed off earlier, the room hadn't. Julian tried to recover the night the way he always did, by working harder. He moved faster, smiled wider, adjusted his posture, as if confidence were something that could be recalibrated on the fly. He reinserted himself into conversations, nodded at jokes he barely heard, repeated lines he'd delivered 100 times before. On the surface, it worked. No one challenged him. No one called him out. But something had shifted underneath. He caught glimpses of Elena as the evening unfolded, always just out of reach. She never lingered in one place for long. Conversations formed around her, then dissolved as she moved on, leaving behind the faint sense that something important had just happened. Julian noticed how often Margaret Lowell remained close, how frequently others deferred to Elena's opinion, with subtle nods and thoughtful pauses. It was infuriating in the quietest way. Julian finally intercepted Margaret near the bar, positioning himself with deliberate ease. "Margaret," he said, lowering his voice, "I was hoping we could speak privately." Margaret regarded him for a moment, then gestured toward an empty corner near the terrace doors. "Of course." They stepped aside, the music dimmer here, the air cooler. "I sense some hesitation tonight," Julian said carefully. "If there's concern about the partnership, I'd rather address it directly." Margaret folded her hands. "Julian, your proposal is impressive. That's never been in question." "Then what is?" She met his gaze. "Alignment." Julian frowned. "In what sense?" "The Hawthorne Trust looks beyond numbers," Margaret said. "They consider continuity, stability, the people behind the vision." Julian felt irritation creep into his voice. "You've known me for months. My track record speaks for itself." "It does," Margaret agreed. "But tonight reminded us that track records are still shaped by character." The word landed harder than he expected. "I'm not sure I understand," Julian said. Margaret's expression softened, but only slightly. "You embarrassed your wife publicly," she said, "in a room where respect matters." Julian let out a breath. It was a joke. Margaret didn't argue. Perhaps, but jokes reveal priorities. Julian felt the familiar urge to defend himself rise, sharp and immediate. "Elena knows how these events work. She understands more than you think," Margaret interrupted gently. "That's precisely the point." Julian fell silent. Margaret glanced toward the ballroom, where Eleni was speaking with two men Julian recognized as trustees. "We invited Elena tonight because her voice carries weight with the Hawthorne family." Julian's pulse thudded in his ears. "Why?" Margaret looked back at him. "Because she represents continuity." The word again. Before Julian could respond, Margaret excused herself and returned to the group, leaving him alone with a realization that refused to fully take shape. Elena hadn't come to support him. She'd come because she mattered. Julian retreated to the terrace, pushing open the tall glass doors and stepping into the cool night air. The city stretched out below, lights glittering like possibilities he'd once believed were infinite. He gripped the railing, breathing slowly, forcing himself to think. There had to be a misunderstanding. He pulled up the Hawthorne Trust file on his phone, scrolling through notes he'd memorized long ago. Trustees, advisors, family liaisons. He stopped when he saw a name he hadn't paid much attention to before. Elena Moreno. His chest tightened. He stared at the screen, then looked back through the glass at the ballroom. Elena was laughing now, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach as she listened to something one of the trustees said. She looked comfortable, not like someone proving herself, like someone returning to a familiar space. Julian's mind raced backward, piecing together fragments he'd dismissed over the years. Elena's consulting work that always seemed to intersect with legacy firms. The private calls she took that she never discussed. The way she spoke about governance and long-term stewardship when he was focused on growth curves and exit strategies. He'd assumed it was theory. It wasn't. The doors opened behind him. Elena stepped onto the terrace, the sounds of the gala muffled once more. She stood beside him, not touching him, not avoiding him either. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Julian said, his voice quieter now. Elena looked at the city. "I needed air." They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them heavy with unspoken truths. "You could have told me," Julian said finally. She turned to him. "You never asked." He bristled. "That's not fair, isn't it?" she asked calmly. "When was the last time you asked me about my work? About what I do now?" Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. Elena continued, her tone steady. "You assumed I would fade into the background once your world expanded. I didn't correct you. That was my mistake." Julian swallowed. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I wanted to see who you became when you thought no one was watching." The words stung more than any accusation could have. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said. "I know," Elena replied. "That's what makes it worse." She glanced back into the ballroom. "They're going to delay the decision," she said. "Not cancel, not yet." Julian exhaled sharply. "You knew?" "Yes." "And you still came?" "Yes." He turned to her, frustration and something like fear mixing in his voice. "Why?" Elena met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because this isn't just your future," she said. "It's ours. And I needed to know whether you understood that." Before he could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Elena," she said. "They're ready." Elena nodded and turned back to Julian. "We'll talk later," she said, not as a promise, as a statement. She went inside without waiting for him. Julian remained on the terrace, the city lights blurring as a truth settled over him with chilling clarity. He hadn't lost the deal yet, but he was closer than he'd ever been. And for the first time in his life, Julian Cross wasn't the one in control of what came next. If you're following this closely, take a moment to like and also subscribe. Stories like this only work when they're told all the way through. When Julian stepped back into the ballroom, the night felt different. Not louder, not colder, just rearranged in ways he couldn't immediately track. He moved toward a familiar cluster near the bar, one he'd anchored earlier in the evening. The conversation paused as he approached, polite smiles offered like placeholders. Someone made a brief comment about the orchestra, another about the wine, and then, almost seamlessly, the group dispersed. Not dramatically, efficiently. Julian stood there for a beat too long, then turned away, Across the room, Elena had taken a seat at a small table near the center, flanked by Margaret and two trustees. Papers lay neatly arranged between them, not contracts, but notes. The kind used when people were deciding whether a future was worth committing to. Julian felt an instinctive urge to intervene, to assert himself, to remind everyone why he was there. He took a step forward, then stopped. For the first time that night, he realized pushing would only make things worse. He spent the next several minutes circling the room, trying to regain footing. Each interaction followed the same pattern. Cordial greetings, brief exchanges, and then an exit. No one confronted him. No one criticized him openly. But the invitations to continue talking never came. It was the most precise form of rejection he'd ever experienced. Meanwhile, Elena's presence seemed to steady the room. People approached her without hesitation. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did, the effect was immediate. Heads nodded, pens paused, decisions edged closer to being made. Julian watched from a distance, his chest tight. He remembered when Elena used to challenge him late at night, long after meetings ended. She'd sit at the kitchen counter, reviewing notes he'd carelessly left behind, asking questions he hadn't prepared for. Why this partner? She'd ask. Why now? Who benefits if this fails? Back then, he'd brushed it off as curiosity. He hadn't seen it for what it was, discipline. As the gala moved toward its final hour, the mood softened. Guests grew looser, laughter more genuine. Deals that weren't being closed tonight quietly accepted that reality. Julian received a text from his assistant. Delayed, not denied, but concerns raised. We'll follow up Monday. He stared at the message, then locked his phone. Margaret rose from Elena's table and approached him once more, her steps unhurried. Julian, she said, I wanted to check in. He nodded. Of course. The trustees appreciate your patience tonight, she continued. They value leaders who can adapt. Julian managed a thin smile. I'm adaptable. I believe that, Margaret said. But adaptability also means listening when the room speaks. Julian hesitated. And what is the room saying? Margaret glanced toward Elena, who was now standing, thanking the trustees before excusing herself. That partnership isn't just about vision, Margaret said. It's about stewardship, about how power is shared. Julian exhaled slowly. Is it over? No, Margaret replied, but it's changed. She gave him a nod that was neither kind nor cruel, then followed Elena. Julian stood alone again, the orchestra winding down, the energy of the room settling into something reflective. He felt the weight of the night pressing against him, not as punishment, but as consequence. When Elena reappeared near the exit, Julian followed her, not hurried, not desperate, just aware that if he didn't speak now, the distance between them might become permanent. Elena, he said quietly. She turned. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for the joke, for the assumption behind it. She studied him for a moment. Go on. I assumed your presence here depended on me, he admitted. I was wrong. Yes, she said simply. I didn't mean to diminish you, he added. But I see now that intention isn't enough. Elena considered that. It rarely is. They walked together toward the doors, the night air cool against their skin as they stepped outside. The city hummed, indifferent to personal reckonings. I didn't come tonight to take anything from you, Elena said, as they paused on the steps. I came to make sure we weren't building something that would eventually collapse. Julian nodded slowly. And are we? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out at the street, the passing cars, the quiet continuity of a world that didn't stop for anyone. "That depends," she said finally, "on what happens next." She placed a hand on her stomach, a small protective gesture that carried more meaning than words. Before leaving, she turned back once more. "The trustees will want to hear from you directly," she said, "but they'll be listening differently now." Julian swallowed. "Because of you." "Because of us," Elena corrected. She walked away then, not waiting for him to follow. Julian remained on the steps, watching as the gala guests filtered out behind them, conversations drifting into the night. The chandelier lights dimmed inside, signaling the end of an evening that had begun with certainty and ended with recalibration. He checked his phone one last time. No new messages. For the first time in years, Julian didn't rush to fill the silence. He stood there, letting the night settle, understanding at last that influence wasn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it was about knowing when to listen. The following weeks unfolded more quietly than Julian expected. There were no dramatic headlines, no public fallout, no doors slammed shut in front of him. Instead, there were delays, meetings that shifted from in-person to virtual, follow-ups that took longer than promised, carefully worded emails that thanked him for his patience without committing to anything tangible. Julian had built his career on momentum, on speed, on pressing forward before doubt could take root. This kind of stillness unsettled him more than outright rejection ever had. Elena, meanwhile, seemed steadier than he'd seen her in years. She didn't gloat. She didn't withdraw. She moved through her days with the same quiet discipline she'd always possessed, attending calls that Julian was no longer privy to, reviewing documents that arrived without explanation. When he asked, she answered honestly, but briefly, not out of spite, out of clarity. One evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the dining table, Julian finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. "How much influence do you really have?" he said. Elena looked up from her tablet. "Enough to matter." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that's accurate," she replied. He leaned back, exhaling. "I thought I was building something permanent." "You were," she said. "You just assumed permanence only flowed one way." The words lingered between them. The Hawthorne trustees reached out the following Monday. This time, the invitation was direct and different, a smaller room, fewer voices. Elena was explicitly included. Julian noticed that immediately. During the meeting, the tone was measured. Questions were sharper. Assumptions were challenged. Elena spoke only when necessary, but when she did, the room responded, not with admiration, with trust. Julian adjusted. He listened more. He answered fewer questions defensively. When Elena clarified a point he'd rushed through, he let it stand. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to dominate the conversation. When the meeting ended, no decision was announced, but no one looked disappointed. Weeks passed. The tension softened into something workable. The partnership resumed, not exactly as Julian had envisioned, but stronger for its recalibration. Governance structures shifted. Oversight expanded. Elena's role was formalized, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. Julian signed the revised agreement with a steadier hand than he'd expected. On the night the deal officially closed, there was no gala, no orchestra, just a quiet dinner at home. Julian poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Elena. "I didn't lose everything that night," he said, "but I lost something. Elena met his gaze. Certainty? He nodded. And arrogance. She considered that, then smiled faintly. Those are replaceable. He laughed softly. You didn't rescue me. I wasn't trying to, she said. I was protecting what we're building. He raised his glass. I see that now. Months later, Julian attended another event at the Halston Grand. Different occasion, different energy. Elena stood beside him, not as an accessory, not as a surprise, but as a recognized presence. When someone approached them and asked how they'd met, Julian answered without hesitation. She was the smartest person in the room, long before anyone noticed, he said. Elena squeezed his hand once, briefly. Across the ballroom, Margaret Lowell caught Elena's eye and nodded. The acknowledgement was subtle, but it carried weight. The orchestra played on. Conversations flowed. The room moved, not around Julian alone, but around something steadier, shared. Julian didn't smile out of habit this time. He smiled because he understood. And somewhere in that understanding was the quiet truth he'd almost missed. The night he laughed wasn't the night he lost everything. It was the night he finally stopped standing alone beneath the chandelier. The room, after all, is always changing. And now you know how to see it. If this story kept you watching, let us know. Where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below. And if you enjoy stories about quiet power, unexpected reversals, and moments that change everything, don't forget to like and subscribe. These stories travel far, and we'd love to have you along for the journey.